Ultimately, what we're inviting is this sort of conscious practice of theological metacognition. To start by saying we do belong to the same community if we're talking about a Christian community.
Part of our book is also talking about the affective dimensions of dialogue and to recognize feelings of discomfort that might result in feelings of anger, feelings of hatred, demonization, or feelings of curiosity.
Hi, I'm Brandon Nappy.
Hi, I'm Hannah Black.
And we're your hosts on The Leader's Way, an audio pilgrimage from Berkeley Divinity School, the Episcopal Seminary at Yale University.
On this journey, we reflect on what matters most in life as we talk about all things spirituality, innovation, leadership, and transformation. Hi everyone, it's Hannah Black, your host of The Leader's Way. And before we dive into our conversation this week, I just wanted to share with you a little bit of feedback that we've recently gotten that has been so encouraging. Katerina says, I'm so glad I found this podcast. I've been listening to it for a few days now, and it's been so helpful and uplifting. I'm a Christian, and I've been feeling so down lately. I'm trying to find my way back to God, and this podcast has been a great help. Thanks so much for letting us know that, Katerina. That is so encouraging, and I'm just really glad that we can be helpful in that way. Susie wrote in to say, hi, I just wanted to thank you for the wonderful gift of the Leader's Way podcast. I recently discovered the podcast after your guest spot on And Also With You, and I have really enjoyed going through the back catalog of the Leader's Way. I'm in the discernment process for a call to holy orders, and I've really appreciated the opportunity to listen and learn with and from y'all. Thanks so much, Susie. It's so sweet, and again, so encouraging. So I just want to take a moment to say, if you are a listener, whether you've listened to one episode or 20, please take a moment and write a little review of The Leader's Way on your favorite podcasting app. Not only is it encouraging and fun to hear from listeners and all of that, but the algorithm loves it and it'll help other people find the podcast. So if you've enjoyed it, help us pass it along by writing a little review. So without further ado, today I'm speaking with Amy Carr and Christine Helmer about their recent book, Ordinary Faith in Polarized Times, Justification and the Pursuit of Justice. In this book, Professors Carr and Helmer address the polarized nature of the United States today and offer a theological framework that allows us to take the risks of speaking with each other about hot-button issues. In the book, they suggest that justification by faith into a beloved community offers us the opportunity to enter into good conflict. Christine Helmer is Peter B. Ritzma Professor of Humanities at Northwestern University. Professor Helmer's other books include How Luther Became the Reformer, The Trinity and Martin Luther, and Theology and the End of Doctrine. Amy Carr is Professor of Religious Studies at Western Illinois University. Professor Carr is also working on another book called Facing Divine Affliction, a Lutheran Theodicy for the Sinned Against. It is part of an emerging series of Lutheran reconstructions of doctrine. It's really an honor to be joined by these two Lutheran women theologian powerhouses, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. Well, welcome to the Leader's Way podcast. I should tell you, I went to AAR this November with a determination to buy 0 books. And so I was joking to everybody that meant a maximum of 3. And I think this is the only book I left with. So that speaks to how much I felt like I needed it. I needed to read it. People needed to hear about this. So I'm really excited to talk about it more with you today. What if we start with the idea of high conflict times? It feels like we're heading headfirst into the thick of another presidential election, and people are starting to feel that tension. And I was reflecting this morning on how I think many people about my age have only been voting age in these high conflict times. So it's easy to think like, well, is it just always like this? So could you talk a little bit about what high conflict times are as a starting point?
Well, yes. And so high conflict is really about a process of engaging in conflict in a way, right, that demonizes another and doesn't really allow for dialogue. I'm not really sure if we've ever been completely absent of it. That's an interesting question. But it does seem like it's certainly at a pitch politically in our country right now, with Republicans not even paying attention to the State of the Union address, right? Kind of that was commented on, creating our own separate worlds. And I think that's at heart part of what we're talking about in our book, is that we've created these different spaces of Christianity as well. We've created these teams mentality where we tend to want to identify with our team and defend our team more than we step back and think about what is it that holds us together.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think our book really intends to outline a set of practices and a set of sort of theological ideas to invite Christians to think about the kind of points of high conflict in their life, which we define as those points of sort of rigid binaries between Christians that prevent people from listening to each other. And our book tries to show that there are ways in which we can overcome high conflict to reach what we call good conflict, which is basically this domain of discourse, understanding, and really a challenge for Christians to become more human in their practices of regarding other Christians as Christians and not as enemies or as political enemies. In the research for our book, we looked at places in the history of Christianity that were marked by conflict. And there's never been a point in Christianity that has been marked by peace or by 100% consensus. Rather, Christianity is a religion that has so many different voices, so many different people with their own interests, with their own theological commitments, with their own spiritual practices that collide or that engage each other in ways that are going to be inevitably conflictual. But good conflict is a way of navigating difference, sometimes even great difference, but is a way of navigating difference in ways that really are attuned to each other as persons, as Christians living out their particular Christian life. And I think that the ethical obligation that we have as Christians to other Christians to try to understand, even if we disagree, sometimes even vehemently, is something that is significant and that we ground actually in an understanding of justification by faith or the beloved community. So our book really intends to promote what we call good conflict, which is the basic exercise in trying to understand each other even when we disagree.
Yeah, and good conflict is also a Manor Ripley's term, right? So we're just developing that in a theological framework. I think that's an underlying theme of our book. There's just lots of great research, lots of great psychological insights about how to listen to one another, how to dialogue, right? And so what we want to do is develop and invite others to further develop a theological framing for thinking about that, in this case through Christian belonging. But one of the sketches we offer in the book is that the creedal controversies were full of high conflict that turned into good conflict. And they did that, and ultimately, even though this is kind of an intervention on our part too, because the language of heresy gets used so much to talk about if you're a feminist, you're a heretic, right? Any position that somebody might disagree with, particularly perhaps right now more from the Christian right, but we'd have to pay attention to see how that discourse is used. But when you look at the history of the Nicene Creed and the doctrine of the Trinity coming along, ultimately the creed, those who signed on to it, were able to hear something that was at stake for somebody else, right? So that getting clear at the distinction between the Father and Son and not just their equal divinity, right? That's kind of a hopeful model from the past, that high conflict can become good conflict. Now, then there's other problems that pop up, right? In later ecumenical councils, but it's a model.
Yeah. Gosh, I'm really tempted to veer from the course here and ask you when something does become heresy, because, heresy does exist, but feminism, I'm going to go ahead and say, is not heresy. But how do we know?
I guess the way we talk about it is, in our book at least, is heresy is taking one particular truth or insight and holding on to it in a way that blocks out other insights.
Yeah.
Right. And again, this is modeled from the creedal controversies. Yeah. And so the paradoxes of Christianity, right, the Trinity and the Incarnation, are attempting to hold together and find a language for bringing together these competing insights.
Yeah. Yeah. So like Jesus is human, Jesus is God. Well, if Jesus is human to the extreme, it blocks out some of the Jesus is God, those kinds of things. Yeah. There's not really a paradox that feminism is tugging on that I can discern.
I think what we're advocating is a paradigm shift away from looking at orthodoxy and heresy as sort of emblematic of high conflict, or presupposing that there's one position on orthodoxy and one position on heresy, and those are constantly going to be at play in a binary. What we're really advocating is that none of us have the complete truth, either of orthodoxy or heresy. So we're kind of following Augustine and his interpretation of the wheat and the tares, that while we are in this life, which means that our perspectives are partial and, of course, are informed by our particular context, our particular locations, social locations, or even ecclesial locations. While we're inhabiting these particularities, we have these obligations and maybe even these desires to get to know other perspectives on truth. And I think that assumption really sort of debunks this orthodoxy heresy binary, which we have inherited. I mean, the Christian tradition is sort of full of this binary between orthodoxy and heresy, but I think it has become unproductive in our contemporary political context, in which the polarization between orthodoxy and heresy is so heightened and intense. And so we try to move away from this traditional notion of orthodoxy and heresy, that in an us versus them binary, and explain that orthodoxy has actually historically, as Amy pointed out, has actually been a product of debates between people who have had different ideas. And then, of course, I think Christianity becomes so much more rich and lively when we listen to other perspectives. If we want to have a living tradition rather than one that is completely petrified in a binary, we should be curious about why other people think the way they do and where they're coming from.
Yeah. So rather than us versus them, it's us and other us who we can learn from.
And that still means we have to debate and make distinctions, right?
Yeah.
But we do that better when one of the number one things I learned in high school debate camp was your own arguments are better if you really listen to and take into account and respond to the best ideas on the other side, right? Show that you can take account of them as well.
Yeah.
I think that development also requires a sort of a personal and sort of discursive practice for all Christians on whatever side of the political spectrum they find themselves. I think we've been sort of socialized into an us versus them mentality, and that is in part due to sort of algorithms and in part due to the particular conversations that are imposed upon us or that determine us in particular ways. But I think that the practices of actually thinking through and representing one's own opinion or one's own perspective in language, either for oneself or for one's group or even for other persons with whom one disagrees, is a practice of faith. And I think we're encouraging people to articulate for themselves what they believe, what they think. And we're hoping that in that practice of articulating for themselves in relationship to others, that they might come to a greater understanding or greater nuancing of their own particular positions. If we just do thumbs up or thumbs down or say I'm pro and I'm con, there's no real thinking, there's no real discursive practice of actually using reason to articulate for oneself why one holds onto a particular position. In my own conversations with people, I have come to a deeper understanding, a more nuanced understanding of some of these hot button issues, because whenever one talks with somebody else, one always arrives at new insights, new perspectives. And this is something that we want to invite Christians to do.
To kind of get at the title of the book, the subtitle, called Justification, the Pursuit of Justice.
Yeah.
I think there's a theological diagnosis we're offering, right, for high conflict. And so let me try to sort of distill it, one way of understanding it. I'm going to use Pauline language because in many ways we're doing this very old-fashioned thing. We're going back to Paul's contrast between justification by faith and justification by works. And a lot of Christians don't really swim in that language very much. Or maybe they do at Yale Divinity School. When I speak with Christians at a variety of churches, unless they're Lutheran, they often don't hear this phrase very much. But if we think about Paul's interest in trying to say the heart of Christian identity isn't about what kind of works you do or how you understand those works, but it's about faith in Christ, baptismal belonging. I mean, one of the ways we could map that today would be that I think in the last several decades, there's been a lot of debate about the nature of the moral law to the extent that we've sort of we're in danger of equating the gospel with the right view of the moral law. So I'm using this phrase moral law right from this Pauline context. So on one hand, you have the right view of the moral law can tend towards, the Seven Mountains movement's patriarchal Christian theocracy and all of its values that are implied. And on the other, the gospel is the social justice gospel, right? So that's the way to caricature it, right? That it gets mapped out. And so we can spend all of our time then trying to make arguments to support those different positions with our abortion, LGBTQ rights, or belonging, women's ordination, whatever it might be. And I think both Christine and I, of a generation where we have been swimming in and part of these constructive theological arguments that expand these notions of justice and belonging, right? So we're very much in that. But what we do in our book is say, well, partly what we also need to remember is that justification by faith in Christ means we belong on the basis of our baptism, and that gives us a frame of reference to come back to, that we are part of the same body of Christ with those who disagree with us.
Yeah.
And that's the space out of which we can risk the kind of mutual listening that Christine was talking about.
I like your use of the word risk there too, because like you were just saying, Christine, it's actually really difficult to bring these conversations up in a world that feels like it is us versus them. Bringing up a question makes it kind of seem like, oh, are you a real one? Why would you be asking about something like abortion or LGBTQIA plus rights or women's ordination? But how do we develop our own thinking if we're not actually talking about it? Yeah, could you say more, Christine, about justification and belonging? And actually, many of our listeners have an MDiv, are priests, but some of them don't have a formal theological education. So could you talk a little bit about what justification is and why we would be talking about justification in a semi-political conversation?
Of course, there are many understandings of justification. And
yes.
This idea of justification really is the heart of the book. Of course, the idea has been around a long time, and what we do is we update the term justification into the language that Martin Luther King Jr. used of the beloved community. And so we tried to show that justification is an understanding of belonging to the community of Christ. It is the beloved community, and it is a gift. So that the theological assumption in the book is that all Christian identity is based on the gift of justification, the gift of freedom in Christ, rather than on an identification with a political position. And so that our diagnosis of contemporary polarization has to do with our understanding that a dominant idea in contemporary Christianity, that Christianity really has to do with justice rather than justification, or a political identity regarding justice seeking rather than a theologically determined identity based on justification. We really constructively use this idea from Luther and about justification by faith as the sort of primary place of gift, of freedom, of belonging, as a place to which one can return, as a place of origin for determining justice seeking. What I also think is important about our book is that this primary understanding of the beloved community is useful for Christians who identify with all different political spectrums. I mean, one might assume that because our book is about dialogue, one usually assumes that dialogue is more part of the discourse on the left rather than on the right. But I think that we're trying to muster discursive practices and invite spiritual practices and ideas about ethical obligations to each other for Christians of all political persuasions. I think part of my commitment to dialogue has to do with my own appreciation for Friedrich Schleiermacher, an early 19th century German philosopher and theologian who was accused of substituting God for humanity. But in my own understanding of Christianity and the way Christianity is constituted as a living tradition really has to do with becoming a person, becoming human. Schleiermacher thinks that the work of Christ is to create persons, which presupposes that we're not persons from the get-go, but that this is a gift of becoming rather than one of being.
Yeah.
And that idea has really meant so much to me, especially as one thinks about the Christian life and becoming persons in social relations and in relations to the environment. One only becomes a person when it becomes human by practicing, by engaging, and by dialoguing. So I think that Schleiermacher's understanding and deep commitment to humanity is one that we can use today in our situation of polarization, that we're committed to the body of Christ as a collection of persons who are becoming persons, and that we practice our humanity by recognizing difference and by doing the hard work and the work of risk and vulnerability in the risk of being misunderstood and misrecognized. But that's all we have. Our resources are these practices of becoming more human. And of course, we can decide that we can shut ourselves off from somebody else. And a source of my deep sadness is when I have been speaking with somebody with whom I disagree, and we've been working towards sort of mutual humanization of each other, and then the conversation gets shut down. I think recently I had a conversation with somebody who let me know that our book was actually contributing to the polarization in America. And I let that person know that books are meant to invite discourse and to inspire new perspectives rather than to conform to pre-existing opinions. And the discussions shut down on the issue of climate denial and climate change. And I think, our book has its limits. There are points where one or another just does not want to discuss any further because one is entrenched in particular opinions. And I think then that's a limit of where this invitation to dialogue can go. There's always that hope, as Schleiermacher talked about, the hope in the echo that at one point a discussion can continue and begin to enter again into uncomfortable dialogue. But there are certain points when discussion breaks down.
Yeah.
And I think that attests to the brokenness of the human condition.
The last chapter is really kind of spiritual practices, a sort of collection of spiritual practices for trying to engage in this dialogue. And so we draw on Benedictine traditions, we draw on all kinds of different practices that have to do with being disoriented and reoriented. It's not recognizing it's not easy. And that might include being called to recognition of something in ourselves when we need to change our own mind, or we feel drawn to changing our own mind.
Yeah. Well, I have to say it's delightful, really, that we just had Rowan Williams on the podcast, and he said something so similar. I was thinking this as I was rereading your book yesterday in preparation for this. I asked him a question about church unity amid basically conflict. And the first thing he said off the bat was about how we receive the church as a gift from God, and it's not something that we've made. It's not something that we're holding together. And it's not really appropriate for us to be like tearing it asunder for that reason. So I really like that you're pointing to that big theological truth about us being a part of the beloved community as a step one, and then taking the risk to have conversations as a step two. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it was like to be two woman theologians writing this book together in high conflict times. Did it feel risky? What were those conversations like? I'm really curious.
I'd like to start by letting our podcast hearers know that it has been just an amazing experience writing together with Amy. We actually wrote the book on Google Docs while on Zoom.
So cool. Wow.
So we didn't physically get together, but we were on Zoom writing on Google Docs. And our prose is really a mixture and a combination of both of our efforts. We started off writing different sections, but then we just welded our own edits and revisions together. So I don't think one can really separate out.
Say, this is Amy's section, this is Christine's section.
Exactly. So our commitment was really to write something responsibly into the gap that we saw. It was a constructive process, both in terms of the actual construction of a new genre that we wrote. It's not sort of theology for the academy,
right?
But it's also,
I really appreciate that about it, I have to say.
Thank you. Yes, we worked hard at this creation of a new genre. What I've learned from Luther is that one one needs genre and language in tandem with another in order to promote a certain rhetoric that is fitting for the times. And the new genre is, I think, a balance between something that is inflected and permeated with our own decades of living and working as theologians, but also our attempts to speak a particular truth into the gap between the us and them in this situation of high conflict. So the actual writing together was our struggle to find the discourse, find the words, find the metaphors, analogies, find the stories that we thought we needed to speak. So the entire book is this process of thinking together about how we could contribute our voices and our commitments and our words to what we see as the problem of polarization.
Well, it's so fitting that you were writing about dialogue in dialogue.
Yeah, we would often start by talking, and one of us, the one who wasn't talking, would be jotting down notes on our Google Doc. And then we'd both start in different sections. And then at some point in the editing process, we literally just wrote over each other's prose. And I would save a Google Doc each day in case something got destroyed that was precious and I wanted to go back to, right?
Yep.
I wouldn't say we often had competing intuitions. I think in this book, we tended to have similar ones. Sometimes we had different knowledge bases. And so integrating that into the whole, and we had to prune parts of it a lot, of course.
Yeah.
But I think it was actually quite easy, at least for me, to kind of get into a flow because we would just sit for 2 to 3 hours, 4 hours sometimes in silence. We'd have the camera on and the mute button on and, type away.
Yes, I think even the genre of co-writing I think it presupposed our own working together with each other about this, what I'd said before about articulating for oneself and for another person one's own position. And the exercise was actually one of clarification for me regarding my own commitments. So the co-writing was actually embodying the practices that we're suggesting for our readers and our hearers, that working together with someone, engaging in these discursive practices of talking about really difficult issues, which involve risk and vulnerability and also, I think, aspects of one's own personality and character that are not very nice. I mean, there are points of conversation when one wants to steamroll over somebody else's opinion. And the practice that I was working through with Amy was one of really trying to pay attention to my own points of and limits, and then overcoming certain limits of actual dialogue and actual writing together. So yes, it was an embodied practice of what we were trying to articulate for our readers.
I think, we didn't really know each other very well when we started this. And Christine, we had written some articles together. And then, if my memory, Christine, you had actually originally wanted to write about justice seeking in the context of Lutheran conferences on justification by faith. And as we worked on it, the thesis evolved to the current one. But I think we both have a habit of working steadily and hard. So it was really easy to fall into the pattern, I think, of doing that together.
I also think that my own institutional location informs my commitments. I work in a research university, in a secular university, so I don't work in a seminary. And some of the practices of dialogue, of academic debate, of academic discussion, I think were shaping my own position. I tried to reproduce in this book. So the book is sort of emerging out of my own practices of engaging colleagues who don't really know anything about theology or assume that theology is something that's really, really bad and one should stay away from.
Right.
So the book was written out of my own practices in the secular university, addressing what Christian theology is in that context and then translating it into the book.
I wonder if we could dive straight into one issue, and this might be an extension of the conversation about what it was like to write, but I attended your book panel at AAR, and I remember you talking about trying to take the issue of abortion almost as like a case study for what you were describing in the book, and doing the work of kind of dialoguing and researching and articulating. And I think you even said something like, well, we came to the conclusion, like you might expect we came to, but we had to get there. What was that like? Like, where did you start? How did you proceed?
Well, we had written one essay earlier that we do describe in the chapter. We'd written one for Lutheran Forum, basically arguing that the Christian freedom, so the freedom of the Christian, one of Luther's essays, we talked about how we are free to discern. So we use that idea of freedom to discern in a situation of moral complexity. So we had already been thinking about it. And I, if I can speak rightly for both of us, Christine, this abortion was not a primary focus for us in our most of our work. And so we did various bits of reading. I certainly engaged a lot Rebecca Todd Peters' book and getting clear on what areas to talk about. Right? We kind of divided up that book. I think I wrote more of the latter half of the chapter, and Christine wrote more of the first half. But for me, the listening part was something that I had avoided doing, which was like, okay, if I'm going to take seriously some of the most difficult claims that are caricatures made on the right, and not just dismiss them, but listen and think with them, what are the questions that emerge? And so some of the parts of that chapter on owning the iconic consequences of our positions came out of that, right? If abortion is a feminist anti-sacrament, what does that mean, right? So somebody might say that we're just trying to take the worst examples, but those are voices that are there. What does it mean to really think with them? Christina, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, again, that we wanted to use abortion as one of our test cases because I think there's so much silence around theological and ethical discussions about the topic. There are, of course, enlarged voices that determine particular positions. But I think, and especially for women, that there is so much silence and shaming around the issue. And it's also a topic that I think women can talk about in relation to different generations. And I saw this, the older generation of women who have their own particular experiences of their high school classmates sort of disappearing one day and who died suddenly because of sepsis of a self-induced abortion. Those stories, I think, didn't really get translated into my generation because my generation was a Roe versus Wade generation. So I think keeping women in the loop about talking to each other across the generations about their particular experiences and inviting conversation about different generational experiences is something I felt very strongly is necessary. I also think that issues pertaining to women, and especially in this election, is one of the most important issues on the political landscape. But on the other hand, there is a lot of silence and a lot of shame and a lot of not knowing. So in order to be an informed voter and also an informed Christian, I think that speech and discourse and storytelling is so important to be shared among the Christian community so that different voices and different stories and different experiences do get heard. We are now hearing a lot of stories, a lot of very, very distressing stories about women who are denied abortions or denied abortion as healthcare. And I think those stories sort of match up with what the women who are ahead of me on the generational genealogy were experiencing. And it's just distressing that women's lives continue to be put at risk.
Yeah, underneath all of that too, like when you think about abortion theologically and listening with these stories theologically, one strand that we developed in that chapter, of course, is what does it mean to be a person capable of bearing a child? When you place all these expectations, and this is an example of the heresy in the sense we use it, when you pick up one particular truth, right, like a fetus is going to develop into a child, 2/3 of the time anyway, right? And you think about spontaneous abortions or miscarriages, then what does it mean to valorize the fetus to such a degree that you eclipse the fuller reality of the personhood of a woman? So part of our chapter just really deep dives into that. But, you know, one of the things I have found myself thinking is that those of us who did grow up in the Roe v. Wade generation didn't have to practice theologically speaking to abortion. It was like that old don't ask, don't tell idea about being gay in the army or queer in the army, right? This is an uncomfortable topic, but we know we have access to it, so let's not talk about it. So I think in many ways, this chapter was our practicing thinking about it in dialogue with people like Rebecca Todd Peters, who've been focusing on that.
Well, and I really appreciated that the chapter is so full of people's stories. There's something really important about that. And I often wonder if you're kind of a right-wing person in a right-wing community, how do you find something to listen to? If you're a left-wing person in a left-wing community, how do you find something to listen to? Do you have any advice about that?
My first thought on that is to pay attention to your own context and where you can invite or are inevitably in conversations with those who are other. I don't think there's one kind of way to do that. But ultimately, what we're inviting is this sort of conscious practice of theological metacognition that to start by saying we do belong to the same community if we're talking about a Christian community. You can make formal comparisons to talk about other religious communities or to what does it mean to be a country, right? But I think that's the framing that we're inviting. And I can well imagine that everyone has their own contexts for doing that.
Yeah.
Right? I'm in rural Illinois, so I've got plenty of context just belonging to my local congregation, right?
Oh, that's interesting. I've only ever been part of congregations that are monolithic, but in both ways. Like I've experienced both sides, but I've never experienced a church community with both things going.
Yeah, well, you might have some insights from that, having dwelled in different spaces.
Totally.
I would say start by getting clear on if we recognize one another as belonging to the body of Christ. So for those on the right, if you look at, say, Christianity Today, one of the kinds of rhetoric you'll see repeatedly is Christian versus secular. So you'll delegitimize a progressive Christian perspective, right? So if we remember justification by faith and baptismal belonging, ideally that would interrupt that.
Yes. Yeah.
We've been talking a lot about discursive practices and cultivating uses of reason in dialoguing with others. But I do want to point out that part of our book is also talking about the affective dimensions of dialogue and the kinds of feelings, the kinds of dispositions, the kinds of subcutaneous, subdiscursive, bodily dimensions that come into play when one discusses with another. And so part of our book is inviting people to look at their embodied affective reactions and their dispositions as they cultivate dialogue. And this is, I think, a really important part of what it means to talk to others, to recognize feelings of discomfort that might result in certain outbursts that are unanticipated. So asking people to look at their feelings of anger, feelings of hatred, demonization, or feelings of curiosity. I think something that I've learned is that curiosity is super, super important as a driving mechanism, as a motivation to wanting to understand somebody else. And I think that for all Christians, being curious about why somebody sees faith and ethics in a particular, looking as it does in a particular way, is something that is sort of driving interest and motivating conversation. And I think so often we have our thumbs up, thumbs down, us versus them mentality. And then this sort of, what we call the heresy of sort of demonizing another. We aren't sufficiently curious about why somebody would want to have a particular position on abortion or climate change or any other of these hot button issues. So curiosity and then affective disposition of curiosity, something that we want to cultivate.
I wanted to build on that briefly. So I teach in a regional public university, so I teach a lot of intro courses to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam at the same time. And one of the things I've started to take into saying to students is, you're not going to necessarily identify with any one of these religious traditions, but as you learn about them, you'll probably figure out, if I were a Jew, this is the kind of Jew I would be, right? Or if I were a Muslim, I'd probably be drawn to Sufism. So you can think about what kind of religion, like thinking about what kind of person you are. And then the next step would be to be curious about somebody who's not like you. So I've long joked with some of my students who might identify as fundamentalists that I'm kind of temperamentally tone deaf to fundamentalism. But as over time, right, I've learned from talking to students, from talking to colleagues, like what is feeding them, right? What nourishes them and having more of a sense of absolutes and less of a sense of mystery, although they would probably push back on my characterizing it that way. But I think another thing that we also do, and this is throughout, but in the last chapter in particular, is in paying attention to affectivity. I guess I would really invite and challenge clergy to be thinking always how to connect psychological perspectives with theological ones. So we tap into the spiritual traditions that come to mind as we were writing. So one is this long-standing way of naming sin in the monastic traditions, presumption and despair. So when are we being drawn into presumption, right? Self-righteousness, whether from the right or the left. And that can tie into the heroic, here I stand on my position, I'm going to denounce the other, right? And then the despair of feeling like it's never going to get better, right? So when we pay attention to our affectivity and then tie it into spiritual traditions within the Christian tradition, it helps inform our theological thinking as well.
So if I'm at Thanksgiving dinner and let's say we're all Christians and we can claim beloved community, but we know or we suspect we don't all agree about some of these hot button issues, what advice do you have for showing up in a way in which you intend to become more human in that kind of environment?
I'm going to have Christine go first on that one.
There are ways of engaging and inviting conversation. One conversation that one advocate for is conversations between women on, say, the issue of abortion. I think one has to gauge sort of degrees of risk, in particular conversations that really require a trusting partner in order to articulate and beginning to practice talking about issues. And I think Amy and my collaboration on this book was our beginning to talk about an issue of abortion. As Amy said, it was a sort of a non-starter for the Roe versus Wade generation. It was just assumed. And I think that there are sort of varying degrees of risk and comfort, and then also expertise. I was not at all an expert on a few of the chapters that we wrote. And I think part of the commitment to speaking our truth into this context of polarization was to be curious and to educate myself on different positions. So I think maybe the Thanksgiving dinner with the risk of somebody throwing the turkey out the window,
right,
might be too risky for some. Of course, there is part of the risk of conversation is the degree to which one desires to be vulnerable to another person. I think start where you're comfortable with and start by asking questions and start with curiosity. Like, why do you think the way that you do? And sometimes the conversation does stop, as in the example I had before. Sometimes it continues, maybe next year. But I think just beginning to cultivate certain practices and affective attitudes towards the other, beginning with what one is comfortable with, and then maybe stretching it a little bit and building alliances. I think what I've also found in this election year is to build alliances with people with whom I would disagree on particular ethical issues, but building an alliance with those people who are also committed to something called peace. My fear is that the differences on particular issues is so great that it will promote violence, and it does promote violence. I mean, we hear stories about violent actions being perpetrated against state election workers and so forth. And I think that in this election year, we can disagree and maybe even table difficult conversations. But I think we need to be committed to a peaceful election year. And I think that theologians and religious practitioners on sort of different sides of the aisle are committed to peaceful navigation of election year. This is something that I want to kind of speak out to all of the hearers of this podcast and readers, that disagreement without violence, a peaceful disagreement, is something that I hope for in this year. And that no matter how much you disagree with someone, peace is what we need to hold up.
Yeah, I think I certainly, in addition to finding out why somebody else thinks what they do, if they're open to that conversation, thinking about where there's already common ground, building off of that. Yeah, I mean, I keep wanting to come back to the idea also of when we do have interactions, paying attention to them and thinking about how to frame them theologically. I just think that's very important. And again, that's not about turning away from other sources of knowledge, but as always, integrating theological perspectives with the findings that we have about studies of human beings from other sources, right? Integrating them together. And I think one thing I found myself thinking about as we were writing our book too is, and also just as somebody who was like in the Lutheran Volunteer Corps years ago and had to learn a lot about working for the Chicago Religious Leadership Network on Central America, learning to be an activist, learning to practice speaking to your legislators, I think that there's a lot of fear. I think so. My number one suggestion at a dinner table is, well, first you have to do care for yourself. But I think practice taking risks and making mistakes. Don't worry about your own perfection and making everything harmonious, right? I think it's a muscle to develop. And that's why we end up having all these sections on sort of thinking about spiritual practices as we get disoriented.
Yeah.
Because I think we just tend to segregate. We talk a lot in the chapter on politics and how we get drawn to our own kinship groups. And it's so easy to do that now. It's so easy to find them, whether they're virtual or in person. So I think, that would be my number one suggestion. Go ahead and get messy and take a risk.
Well, speaking of these spiritual practices, is there one that you could share with our listeners?
I'll share one that is in the back of my mind throughout this book, and that's Luther's Small Catechism, remembering your baptism as you confess your sin daily. It's so simple. Luther was certainly no paragon of, sinlessness, right? He was, but the kind of simple desperation that he voices in the Small Catechism about our absolute need to do that. And of course, we know that in the context of feminist analyses, that can look like you're just trying to focus on your self-loathing. But more, I think it's these acts of metacognition or recognition, right? When, however we are feeling affectively, bring them there. And then that remembrance of our baptism as a touchstone to remind us that, yes, we belong to this person or this community, these groups that we really disagree with. We're part of the same body of Christ. And so then all other senses of direction and debate kind of flow out of that.
This past quarter, I taught Luther's Freedom of a Christian, and I've been meditating on this subject matter of what it means to be a Christian who is freed by Christ. I would invite our hearers and readers to think about what it means to be free in Christ in one's own particular embodied life. And I think Luther's idea of freedom and the beloved community is so radical. And in our sort of context in which we're worried about ethics and laws, I'd like to try the reverse and what it means to be a Christian freed in one's own ethical and spiritual and intellectual practices. What does that mean? And I think that this is a sort of a deep mystery. Freedom is an incredible, precious gift. It is also something that is really hard won. And especially those of us who have inherited the Protestant Reformation, which is so much based on freedom from captivity to lies, to false practices, to laws, human-made laws that are designed to limit people's options. What does it mean to be freed by Christ, to think, to be curious, to be aware, self-aware, and to be free to become more human in relationship to each other? That's something that I find just incredibly beautiful and inspiring and provocative idea that we can go back to in this election year.
I might riff on that a little bit too. In the last chapter, we also talk about, as a spiritual practice, a sort of sense of play. To revisit that team mentality, we can have, all that matters is my team winning. But something I've observed, if I may give a theological reading of sports broadcasters,
please,
as a fan of professional hockey, I have been so struck by how these broadcasters find a way of naming and owning every feeling, every affective feeling, right? You interview a player, raw emotion. You name the thoughts the fans are thinking, but you do it in a way that calls you back again and again to the value of the sport. You lift up things that are, noteworthy about the other team. And so you own the partisanship, which is always going to be there in a game, but you also value the sport itself, the beauty of the sport, the integrity of the sport itself, right? And so I think if we can, do something similarly with the church, Just as in Paul's day, it's so comforting that the early church was so conflicted, right? Paul was trying to say, yes, we're going to disagree about whether or not it's okay to eat food sacrificed to idols. But let's remember that difference isn't about the basis of our belonging. We can fight about that because we're in the same community together.
Well, I wonder if I might ask you one final question, which we tend to make a habit of asking people. And that's, what's giving you hope these days?
This is the first thing that popped into my mind. Let me just say first that in many ways, this book was like an extended meditation, right? And so in many ways, it converted my own perspective to these habits that we were trying to point to, that we intuited about, justification in the sense of justifying our positions. It's not about not holding back or trying to find a neutral ground on these contested moral topics, but doing it in this context of really recognizing the face of Christ in our neighbor, right? Trying to do that. But I find myself thinking, as we have students who come and go all the time. We might have one conversation with a student and a long conversation with a student and never see them again. And one thing I found myself thinking just intuitively is that even though there's that one conversation and a student, there might be conflict of some kind in that, something somebody's really wrestling with in regard to the course material. That moment is not frozen in time. So the eschatological picture, right? That we have these conversations, these difficult conversations. We don't know where they're going to end, but we can trust that God is at work beyond our own risks and our own encounters. And sometimes that bears fruits in ways I can see. So, a student who would identify as fundamentalist, he went to Liberty University. We sent each other a book every year. He came out as gay in recent years. And he thanked me for pushing him on things he didn't want to be pushed on years ago. And not that I was advocate, I just introduced the perspectives. That's what we do. Here's the range of arguments on all these positions. And I'm not saying that's the only hopeful outcome. I just find myself thinking, when you're in a position of teaching students and you're not, as in a congregation, seeing people over a longer period of time, to remember that you have to let go of knowing how everything's going to come out in someone else's life or perspective. And at the same time, learn from those encounters ourselves.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can speak very much to hope, because I think in my own understanding of polycrisis and climate change, there's just very little to hope towards. So I prefer to use another term, and that is it's not something that is kind of readily available. I prefer to think about being grounded, and what strikes me is that the one passage in the New Testament that talks about being grounded on the rock, being grounded on Christ. That seems to me an apt metaphor of what it means to live in the contemporary world, when so much is changing, when there's so much fear, when there's so much anxiety among especially our students. There's so much anxiety about upward mobility. There's so much anxiety about climate. And I think staying grounded in one's commitments to God, who is the hope for the world. And I think maybe that's very sort of a personal, spiritual perspective. But I think that practices of staying grounded and peaceful and calm, even as the world is changing so much, and as the world is being kind of shaken up so much, is something that means a lot to me in these days.
Yeah. It strikes me too that a vision of ourselves becoming human, a vision of belonging to a beloved community, that's all very hopeful. And it doesn't necessarily need to be hope for the way our world is headed or anything, but we do have a greater hope in Christ, I think. And that's really important. And it doesn't mean that we don't seek justice right now. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Leaders Way podcast. This has been such a gift to me, and I'm excited to share it with the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hannah.
And for inviting us.
Thank you for listening to The Leader's Way. We hope you were encouraged and inspired. To learn more about this episode, visit our website at berkeleydivinity.yale.edu/podcast.
Rate and review us, and follow the podcast to make sure you never miss an episode. Follow Berkeley at Yale on Instagram for quotes from the podcast and more.
Until next time.
The Lord be with you.